Welcome and thank you for joining me. I am Veron and this is just another voice. For those of you who joined me in my first attempt at this channel, welcome back. Hopefully things go smoother this time. I've taken the time to step back and reevaluate my priorities, and I've returned to this project with a more defined vision of what I hope to accomplish here. I am now dedicated to producing only the best possible content I can for you here, and that means carefully selecting my topics and taking the time to thoroughly research and edit my scripts to ensure I spend my time only on content I can be happy having put out there. For those of you who are new to the channel, make some noise for me in the comments, I hope you enjoy most of all. I should give you a general idea of what to expect here. Yeah, all sorts of nerdy crap. But I often take fiction and this kind of thing rather seriously and can become quite passionate about it. I should, since I aspire to be an author and or screenwriter/director someday, like many YouTube creators who do this kind of content. I love fiction, but when I take it rather seriously and get frustrated with certain things in the world of entertainment, I get people asking me, "Dude, why are you so worked up about it? It's just entertainment. It doesn't affect anything. Chill out." And to that, I must respectfully disagree. It's why I'm so passionate, because fiction does have an effect on the real world. If you haven't noticed, it's a big part of our lives. It's everywhere, and in this video, I want to explore why. Why made-up people and stories have an impact on our day-to-day lives, and why it's worth caring about. As you may have guessed from the thumbnail, in addition to being a good introduction to my channel, I chose this topic in response to the current controversy surrounding Amazon's The Rings of Power. This is the closest thing to a devoted video on the upcoming Amazon series that I intend to make, but I will leave a few links in the description to some of my favorite videos on that certain to be abomination. Anyway, if that's what you're here for, then buckle up and let's get started. There's no question that fiction is a pillar of our culture, and has been from the dawn of civilization. We've told stories about made-up people for as long as we've been talking and swinging tools. It's ingrained in our nature to use our imaginations to conjure up stories of people who never existed. Surely the nature of storytelling has evolved and grown in complexity and changed in function over the years. But the question is, why? What purpose does it serve? Is it, as those who say, it's just entertainment, suggest, pure escapism? Did it simply give our ancestors a way to break from the stresses of life by fantasizing about the lives and exploits of others? Perhaps, but there's evidence for so much more. We use fiction to explore our own humanity. We use these hypothetical stories to ask the questions we perhaps don't know how to ask any other way, and often pose our own answers. We ponder things in the lives of imaginary individuals that perhaps have special meaning to us. We relate to these people we invent because they reflect something in each of us and teach us about ourselves. By projecting ourselves onto another, we can gain perspective and insight into our own condition, which maybe we couldn't have otherwise. Fiction can be a powerful tool for deeper thinking, and similarly, by putting ourselves directly in the mind of another, seeing ourselves in the shoes of people living hundreds of lives we cannot possibly live ourselves, we can greater develop a powerful attribute that is essential to our humanity and invaluable to society: empathy. We can understand not only ourselves, but people in general, and learn to relate to them. We connect with them so much better because of fiction. Perhaps our affinity for storytelling is responsible for making us human. Perhaps our society itself is built upon our ability to make up people in our head and invent lives for them to lead. But if that's why fiction is so important to us in such a broad sense, why is the integrity of our stories in particular worth preserving? Well, just as society is built upon fiction, the culture of any given society is built upon the stories of its time. Thus, history is written by fiction. Every story is a product of its time, reflecting not just the questions and intents of the author, but the zeitgeist of their time. These are worth preserving so that we may learn from them of the people who wrote them, so that we may get a glimpse of the time in which they were written. Not to say it is a bad thing for stories to evolve. Some characters and stories have transcended their time to become legends, staples of our culture that have been reinterpreted and reinvented throughout the ages to reflect the zeitgeist of any given era. These characters are powerful because of their versatility, and I love many of them. But I believe it's important not to see all stories as things that can be taken, appropriated, and molded according to the beliefs of any given generation. Not to say this can never be done, but I find it important never to let our own cultural sensibilities supersede those of the past. That is nothing short of arrogance. In so doing, we erase and rewrite our own history because we don't like what we see in it and want it to suit us. The writers of the past can speak to us and teach us from their time, teach us things we may have forgotten, and rewriting their words because they offend us or we see them as outdated is, simply put, Orwellian. One of the most controversial topics in the world of fiction and entertainment is adaptation. The very concept of translating a story with all its layers, all the deeply embedded messages that make it what it is a very tricky thing to attempt, and I would be surprised if it has ever been done to universal praise, because it is impossible to do so without using some measure of creative liberties in the process. That's just the nature of it. Creators must use their own interpretation of the source material to make tough decisions and calls that won't necessarily please those who loved the original work. It's virtually unavoidable. So the question is an adaptation really bound to the source material, or is it its own work? Is it fair of us to expect something to be something it is impossible to be, when that thing already exists? And should we just let it be something new? It is an interesting argument that I have given considerable thought to in making this video, but I still fall on the side of wanting a faithful adaptation. I'm not a total purist. It's impossible to be a total purist and be happy. I understand the nature of adaptation across mediums, but I believe the key is truly understanding the heart of the original work, the bundle of messages, themes, and cultural reflections that lurk in the subtext and truly set it apart. I believe that truly understanding that is the first step to making a successful adaptation, and once that is in place, a true artist can go about figuring out how to bring it to life in a different medium. And ultimately, there is never such a thing as a definitive adaptation, as we cannot help but reimagine. Only the original author could possibly translate it the way they would want it, but even then, does that make their adaptation more valid than someone else's? As Peter Jackson said of his legendary trilogy, no, not that one, yes, that one, any films will only be an interpretation of the book. We have to accept that every adaptation is, to a degree, its own thing, but as I see it, in order to rightfully claim to be considered an adaptation, it must first understand and faithfully seek to realize the vision, the essence of the original work. Because when that core is altered, something is lost. Something the original artist wanted to say is silenced. We need to hear the author's voice in the pages and let it carry through to the screen. People have been saying it doesn't matter if there is a bad adaptation, there will always be the original work. And, well, yes and no. Because whether we mean them to or not, our words tend to drown out those of the past. And when something is updated for a new age, if the new version of that thing is what a new generation grows up on, what they see will define it for them. Disney's Star Wars franchise is what kids think of now when they hear Star Wars. And while the original films certainly are not by any means dead, in time they could be forgotten amongst the new movies and shows rather than preserved by them. I'm not saying that will happen, but I can see it as a possibility. So it's not unreasonable to fight against adaptations and reinventions that have the potential to negatively redefine a generation's image of the story you love. So what is the difference between adapting an artist's work and reinterpreting a myth, a cultural icon like a comic book hero for a modern audience? I mentioned that some properties have become so ingrained in the common consciousness that they stick with us and are retold endlessly over the generations. Whether ancient myths, comic book superheroes, or characters like Sherlock Holmes, for example, that have stood the test of time to be reinvented and brought into the modern day time and time again. Are these somehow different? Are these exceptions to the rule? Are they evidence that I'm full of it and all adaptation is in fact completely open to reinvention? Well, after some thought, I've concluded that no, they are not that different, but some things are by their nature far more malleable than others. They still have a heart that must be preserved, and fans will most often reject a reinvention that they feel misses that. It's just that that heart is something much more simple in trappings that can be much more easily swapped out without changing it too much. But then how do you tell what the heart of something is? I think time is the perfect test of what truly lies at the heart of something, of what makes it so endearing. With time, trappings and details are lost, stripping the legends to their barest bones and revealing what lasts and makes them so applicable to any time and place. Legends of old from centuries past have had the longest to do this, but comics provide a great example as well, whose evolution we can look back on. Over the last century, comic book characters have been redefined and reimagined more times than there have been individuals to contribute to them, with countless authors, artists, and publishers bringing their own visions to the table. Some characters have proven themselves more enduring than others because of what they stand for, and when what makes that character so timeless is lost, such as with Batman in the Silver Age or Superman post-Flashpoint. It doesn't take long for writers to recognize the problem and return them to form. I don't know when something becomes a cultural property more open to interpretation, but I believe all truly timeless stories have a soul. It's what makes them timeless in the first place, and preserving that whenever you try to reimagine them is key. However, I do not believe that all stories are so open to re-envisioning. The Lord of the Rings is possibly the greatest example of a work that is made timeless by, well, its entirety. The sheer scope and detail of its vision, the sublime beauty and power of its messages. It is not something to be played with and reimagined for new audiences over the years. It deserves to be preserved in all its glory. I could make a whole video about my thoughts and feelings on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and maybe I will someday, but suffice it to say, they're not perfect films, nor a perfect adaptation. If you think they are, you haven't read the books. I defend the obvious changes, like the removal of Tom Bombadil and the scouring of the Shire. That last one alone I could make a whole video on, and maybe I will just to defend my position. But many frustrate me. Each film deviates further from the books, and in the process does things that I feel detriment the story, or just don't make sense. But the reason the films nonetheless hold up so well as a masterclass in filmmaking and adaptation is that everyone involved in the project gave their all, because they cared. It was a true labor of love for these people who sought only to bring Tolkien's vision to life, not to put their own stamp on it, or use it as a vehicle for their own messaging. And that level of care, devotion, and passion leaves something palpable infused in every particle of the production, something that just can't be faked. Everyone knows the quote by Peter Jackson that's been flying around lately. We made a promise to ourselves, at the beginning of the process, that we weren't going to put any of our own politics, our own messages, or our own themes into these movies. What we were trying to do was to analyze what was important to Tolkien, and to try to honor that. In a way, we were trying to make these films for him, not for ourselves. That perfectly encapsulates the attitude the creators of any adaptation should have. And you can pick out the adaptations that follow this philosophy at a glance. Harry Potter, The Chronicles of Narnia, and the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones are other prime examples. You can point to many reasons the Hobbit movies failed, but at their heart was the simple fact that they were clearly motivated by little more than a production studio's greed. They saw an opportunity to repeat the phenomenon of the original trilogy and jumped on it in a blatant cash grab. Just look at the two side by side, and it's clear there just wasn't the same dedication or passion behind the more recent movies. And that is the problem with Amazon's adaptations to the 10th degree. They don't care about the source material. They just want to appropriate the big names to milk as much dough off of them as possible, to make them into the new Star Wars or Marvel. The Rings of Power was not built from the ground up by true artists who cared about bringing this to life. It was whipped up in a boardroom by opportunistic corporate executives who then hired the people who would make it according to their specifications with their ideological message in mind for the lowest common denominator of the audience. This is ultimately what makes or breaks entertainment for me. Whether it's really a work of art or just a cash grab, I can feel that difference. It's why I lost interest in Marvel pretty early on, and in part why Warner Bros. Has been unable to get anything going with DC. It's why Disney's Star Wars is floundering, and why most reboots and adaptations of the last decade have been poorly received. Cheap, money-driven cash grabs never last. It is true art that becomes a part of history. Well, that was my video essay on the topic of adaptation and reinvention in fiction. If you liked what you saw, please like and subscribe and share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it. If you have thoughts of your own on this subject or anything I touched on, whether or not you agree with me, please share them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to read them and engage with you. If you want, here's a quick preview of my next video. If that looks like something you'd want to see, then please get that notification bell on. I've got lots of ideas for videos I'm looking forward to making, and I hope you enjoy. Until then, never stay silent.